So what's the right way? What's the right way to think about Peirce's metaphysics, if that's a topic that's worth discussing? So I told you, I think I mentioned when I was describing Peirce's own biography that that he read Kant early on, right? So I think he even reported that, you know, by the time he was in his like late teens, early 20s, he had digested like every word of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and had sort of thought deeply about it in every way in which one can think deeply about it. Right? He claimed a certain kind of like intellectual mastery of the work at a very early age, and he subsequently wrote a paper on Peirce, and this was also a paper that he wrote very young. It was probably like in his mid-20s, I think, when he wrote this paper, called what was it called? On a new, on a new set of categories or something. On a new list of categories. Sorry, on a new list of categories. And it's a really obscure, kind of opaque, dense philosophical paper in which Peirce attempts to kind of to take Kant's categories and rewrite them, to rethink them all. Okay, so I think we mentioned this in the last conversation also. So the way that Kant thought about logic, right, was that he thought, you know, one of his great innovations in the first Critique of Pure Reason, as by his own acknowledgement, was to put logic before metaphysics, right? So we first think about what are the fundamental forms of judgment. That's logic. We first figure out what those fundamental forms of judgment are. These are the kind of these are the forms of judgment that are sort of so basic that they're constituted with the very notion of like thinking, very notion of thought. We first identify those basic forms of judgment, and then we derive our metaphysics by thinking about what is needed, okay, to render coherent those forms of judgment. So what's kind of implicated in those forms of judgment, right? So Kant gives a list of like what he thinks are like the basic forms of judgment, and then he gives a corresponding list of what he takes to be his like metaphysical categories. So Peirce's attitude towards Kant is this. Of course, Kant is right that this is the correct approach, right? To start with logic, right? So first write down what are the fundamental forms of logic, the fundamental forms of judgment, let's say. And then we derive our metaphysics from that, right? The problem, according to Peirce, is that Kant's logic was all wrong. It was completely bogus. Like from Peirce's point of view, Kant basically like, he got his logic by reading a textbook that was like circulating at the time and just writing some things down. So almost all of the distinctions that Kant draws are distinctions that Peirce thinks are not real fundamental distinctions in logic, right? And so Peirce, who, you know, had a very deep understanding of the history of logic, obviously, had a different view of what the fundamental forms of judgment are, and a correspondingly different view of what the basic metaphysical categories are. And according to Peirce, there are really three basic forms of judgment.
This is triadism.
This is triadism. This is triadism. There are three basic forms of judgment. They correspond roughly to the kind of judgment that involves, let's say, predication. So simple predication. Okay.
Is that firstness?
That's firstness, right? So, okay, yeah. So simple predication. Then the kind of judgment that puts two things in relation to one another. Okay. And then another kind of judgment, which puts three things in relation to each other. Okay. And that's it. Those are the only kind of basic judgments that we need to do all of logic. And so for Peirce, this was reflective of an actual technical result that he believed he had established, which is that like all that you need are one place, two place, and three place relations to do the entirety of logic. Right. And he had various results which showed that like you can develop this system of logic based only on these three simple kinds of judgments. And, you know, he claimed completeness on behalf of that system of logic. So he's like, these are the basic three forms of judgment. So what are the metaphysics? What are the metaphysical categories corresponding to them? So the metaphysical categories are the categories that Peirce famously calls firstness, secondness, and thirdness in his own, like, you know, peculiar way. So what are those metaphysical categories, right? So those metaphysical categories are the category. So what the category of firstness is, right, is the mode of being whereby an object exists and is what it is simply in virtue of itself and nothing else. Secondness is the mode of being in which an object is what it is in virtue of its relation to something else. And thirdness is the mode of being by which an object is what it is in virtue of its relationship to another thing through what Peirce called a third, through an interpreter. And these are three distinct, like, metaphysical categories. These are three distinct modes of being. And Peirce believed that all three of these things, all three of these categories, were sort of operative in nature. They were operative in the cosmos. Yeah. And so, I mean, to get back to your point about, so this is all a very abstract way of describing the three categories. Peirce had most of what his later writings consist of are different ways of kind of elaborating this theme of the triad, right? So what do we mean by the firstness and the secondness and the thirdness that is manifest in the cosmos? So for Peirce, firstness, the thing that is what it is in virtue of itself and nothing else, corresponds roughly in sort of cosmological or even physical terms to pure chance, right? This is why Peirce calls himself a tychist. So he believes in genuine chance in the world, right? That is genuine spontaneity, right? Kind of something from nothing, so to speak, right? That's the element of chance in the world. That corresponds to Peirce's metaphysical category of firstness. Secondness for Peirce is something like a sort of brute, law-like connection between things. So it's sort of like causality, if you will. Secondness is probably the hardest thing to come to grips with for Peirce, but it's like bruteness, right? It's the part of the world that is just like the other, right? So you imagine like two things in brute contact with one another, nothing mediating between them, but two things in brute contact with one another. Peirce often thinks like, you know, like a certain conception of like a law-like association between things, right? This fact is here because that fact is here. So brute causality, unmediated causality is kind of secondness in the world. And thirdness is, what is thirdness? Thirdness is like growth, the process of something becoming something else, like through an intervening process of development, if you will. And so Peirce thinks all of these things are operative in the world. There's pure chance, there's law, and there's also this other thing, which is kind of organismic growth. And all three of these things are present in the cosmos. And all three of these things are needed in order ultimately to give a satisfactory explanation of the whole of the universe. Remember, one of the things we talked about, I think in our last conversation, was this issue about like, what would it mean to explain everything? What would it mean to explain the whole universe, right? How could we possibly do that? Wouldn't it have to comprehend like itself and everything like that? So Peirce's kind of reaction to this is to say, it's different than Leibniz's, but Peirce's reaction to this problem is to say, the kind of explanation that we need to give of the universe is one in which we see the universe itself, the cosmos itself, as an evolving organism. It's something that is like changing and growing and developing. And that's the only framework in which we can make sense of why the world is the way that it is. So for example, what about like the natural laws of the universe? How did they come to be? Right? Can we explain why the natural laws of the universe are what they are? What kind of explanation might that look like? I mean, wouldn't such an explanation have to appeal itself to other natural laws already in place? And don't you just get some kind of like weird regress or circularity or something? So Peirce's explanation, and this is pretty radical, is to say that the laws themselves have not always been laws in the perfected sense of the term. That the laws themselves are the product of a process of evolution where early on the laws exhibited a certain kind of chance variation, a chance variability. They didn't hold in perfection.
Right? Sounds like contemporary cosmology to me.
It's very close to it. And there are contemporary cosmologists, Lee Smolin being one of them.
Yeah, I talked to him on Sunday.
Perfect. He's like very deeply influenced by Peirce. I'm surprised Peirce didn't come up in that conversation. Should have. Because I think he is quite influenced by Peirce. But they have a very similar view on this score, where it's like the laws of the universe sort of evolve. They have become what they are, right? And so this is part of Peirce's theory. Like when we look around at the world and we see that there are parts of the world, the physical parts of the world, what we call the physical parts of the world that are well behaved and that are subject to laws. And then there are these other parts of the world that seem much less well behaved, that seem much more chaotic and spontaneous, like the minds of agents that we encounter. This is not that, Peirce is not a dualist. So it's not that there are two different worlds here. There's the world of law and then the world of mind. It's rather that what we call the world, the physical world, the world of fixed law, is just a world in which mind has evolved to the point that its habits have become really fixed, So like our minds are also evolving in that direction. We're evolving in the direction of more and more fixed habits, of becoming more and more predictable, becoming more and more part of the physical world. And so that's just part of the process of like, cosmic evolution or something. So this is all part of Peirce's cosmology. There are aspects of it I don't agree with, but it would get into too many of the details to pick nits here. So,
if there were like 100 things to say before, there's a lot more than that now. But maybe starting with some of your thoughts on the history of philosophy, beyond some of the names that you mentioned, like Leibniz or Aristotle, I mean, even the more contemporary huge names like Quine or David Lewis or Wittgenstein, they're all people who had these consistent worldviews and programs and systems. And readers today, even though all three of them have passed away, you very much feel like you know them and you connect with them and you read about them. And then your idea about getting your conceptual house in order, totally resonates with me. So I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel very strange referring to myself as a philosopher, and I'm not even a professor like you. I think of Aristotle as a philosopher, but I don't know what we are in contemporary times. But to the extent that I think like a philosopher, I mean, I'm very interested in facts too, but I'm not that interested in pursuing proofs in geometry, but I am very interested in getting my conceptual house about the philosophy of mathematics in order and understanding truth in mathematics and these sorts of things. But okay, now getting on to Peirce and his metaphysics. So if
can I say one thing?
Yes.
Can I make one connection? Because I know there's been a lot that we've that we put on the table here. But so one of the interesting aspects of Peirce's triadic metaphysics, this distinction into sort of the categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, and treating these as like fundamental. It's not just that. So Peirce is somebody who believes that all three of those categories are in operation in the cosmos. That's like sort of part of his distinctive triadism. But what's interesting about Peirce is he thinks that you can kind of understand the different metaphysical systems and the different perspectives on the universe that philosophers have adopted throughout the history of the subject in terms of these three categories as well. Meaning you can kind of you can understand a philosopher based on which of these three categories they countenance. So some philosophers will focus on one of these three categories to the exclusion of the others, tacitly, not explicitly, because all the categories are Peirce's own terminological invention, but like tacitly in their philosophical writings, they'll focus on one of these categories to the exclusion of the other, or two of these categories to the exclusion of the other, and they'll deny one of the categories from being in operation. And so it's a beautiful way of like schematizing the history of metaphysics. You can kind of organize it into different types, right? Based on which of the categories play a prominent role in those respective metaphysical systems. And so, for example, I think one kind of extreme example of this that gives a lot of insight into this particular figure is Leibniz. We've talked about Leibniz many times. Probably what makes Leibniz and his metaphysics so distinctive is that he is really, properly speaking, a philosopher of firstness. He really only believes. So at its fundamental level, the only thing that is firstness. the only kinds of objects that exist in the world are objects that are what they are in virtue of themselves and nothing else. So this kind of weird idea, right, reaches its kind of full maturation in Leibniz's monadology, where the things that really exist are these weird things that he calls monads, right? And what the monads are these things which are what they are independently of every other monad. So they don't touch each other. The monads don't touch, they don't scrape, they don't come into kind of like causal contact with one another. There's none of that like secondness. There's none of that interaction. Every monad is a universe unto itself and is like complete in itself. And what the universe is just a collection of these monads. It's kind of the only kinds of things that could be are things which are what they are in virtue of themselves and nothing else. That's kind of the principle that like sort of drives a lot of Leibniz's thinking in a lot of different areas, not just metaphysics. Yeah. So he has, yeah, exactly. So Leibniz has very specific views about chance, which put him much closer to Peirce than to a lot of other figures in the history of the subject. So he's very motivated by this idea. It doesn't come out in an explicit rejection of secondness or an explicit rejection of thirdness. It comes out in a kind of feeling of unease at kind of bruteness in the world. Leibniz hates the idea of there being something brute in the world. Like
because of his religious beliefs? Maybe,
for whatever reason, he's like philosophically predisposed to hate that kind of brute interaction. He doesn't like it. So he philosophizes around it, right? He's trying to build a system which doesn't really in any deep sense like countenance it. He doesn't like it. His deep commitment to the principle of sufficient reason is an expression of this.
Exactly.
Right? He doesn't like there to be things which are there without an explanation, right? The principle of sufficient reason isn't itself like a commitment to just firstness, but it is in some sense a kind of rejection of secondness. It doesn't like, it's like there shouldn't be things that just happen for no reason, right? That just happen as a matter of brute fact. That kind of bruteness shouldn't really be a part of the world, right? And so he goes out of his way to try to kind of avoid it and circumvent it, right? It comes out in all sorts of other subtle ways in Leibniz's thinking as well. Like he doesn't like the idea of what Aristotle calls like accidental truths. And we might have talked about this in the previous conversation. I don't remember, but it's like the idea that, for instance, when I say something contingent, like the cup is on the table, he doesn't like the analysis of that claim that presents it as if the predicate is just accidentally in the subject. Being on the table just somehow finds itself in the subject, right? For Leibniz, this is not a sufficient ground for truth because ultimately the world can't be that way. It can't be such that one thing just finds itself in something else.
It has to be necessary.
It has to be. So he finds a way around necessitarianism. That thought leads him in the direction, as he himself admits, of a kind of necessitarianism. But then ultimately he tries to find his way around it. So that all of it, but forgetting for the moment, like how he does that, what's important to what gives you a real feel for how Leibniz thinks is like this desire to avoid putting this thing in the world, this kind of thing, right? What Peirce calls secondness, but it's this idea of like bruteness, of there just being something brute, right? Something just like basic, something otherwise unaccounted for in the world. Leibniz hates that. And his whole philosophy in some sense, even to the point that it reaches this crazy systematic view of things, is all engineered in my view. It's kind of all engineered to avoid having to put that element of reality into his fundamental metaphysics. It's just a feeling. He doesn't like it. So knowing that about Leibniz, you learn something very deep about him, right? He's the kind of person who just can't tolerate that kind of bruteness being in the world. A figure like Kant, much happier to accept it. Much more happy to accept it. So Kant's descriptions of like sensible intuitions, there's a lot of bruteness there.
Exactly what I was thinking.
There's a lot of bruteness there. And so, I think these categories are really like helpful for, even if they only, they only have this explicit significance in Peirce's metaphysics. They're just really very useful devices for trying to organize and systematize.
I can see Aristotle being very into thirdness.
Very into thirdness. So very into thirdness.
In the process of being, becoming.
Absolutely. And so the great philosopher of thirdness was Hegel. Hegel is he's basically Kant without the secondness. So Hegel tries to take Kant and he tries to get rid of all of this, like this noumenal stuff, all of these sensible intuitions, and he tries to give a kind of like process-based reconstruction of Kant. And so Hegel and the people who follow in Hegel's school are philosophers of thirdness. Here's another way that it manifests itself. So I'll tell you because we've talked about logic on many occasions. So for Peirce, the way that firstness, secondness, and thirdness relate to logic, right, is that the logical entity that exhibits firstness is the concept or the term, right? So a concept like red, let's say, is what it is just in virtue of itself, nothing else. It's not connected to any other concept. It just is what it is, right? So to the extent that it has being, its being derives entirely from its own internal coherence. If it's a coherent concept, it is, in the only sense in which concepts can be, right? That they are kind of internally coherent. Secondness, the logical entity that embodies secondness for Peirce, is a proposition, because it's two concepts in relation to one another, right? So think like Frege, right? When Frege talks about a proposition, he divides it into two parts. There's the saturated part and the unsaturated part. And the proposition is this kind of like collusion between the saturated and the unsaturated part, right? But both of them like are connected in the form of the proposition. So the propositional judgment is a kind of like two-part structure, if you will. It has this thing which is like saturated and this thing which is unsaturated. So when I say like the cup is on the table, the unsaturated thing is like on the table, being on the table. The saturated thing is the cup. That's the thing that has reference. And I put them together and I get a proposition, right? The cup is on the table. So for Frege, like that Fregean concept of a proposition for Peirce is very closely tied to like secondness. Thirdness is like an inference. It's like when I reason that, think a kind of standard syllogism. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? Here, the middle term is sort of mediating between the other two terms, right? So in this inference, I have a connection between Socrates and mortality that's mediated by Socrates' manhood. So there's a kind of for Peirce, there's a kind of triadic structure to inference. And so inference is like the embodiment of thirdness. Okay. There are details here, but let's just go with this. Okay. So concepts are firstness, propositions are secondness, inferences are thirdness. You can have all sorts of different views in logic about which of these notions is basic, right? So for instance, there's a whole school of thought, which is sometimes called inferentialism, right? Which subscribes to the view that the meaning of a proposition, like what it really means, is just given by the system of inferences in which it belongs, right? Like what are the various things that you can infer from it? And that's how you figure out what the meaning is. The meaning is nothing other than that, right? So this is a view that's like very famously associated with like Robert Brandom, but others have subscribed to some similar version of the view also, inferentialism. And so that's like a kind of thirdness view, right? That's a view that what matters is not like what gives a proposition meaning is not just the two things standing in relation to themselves, but really this whole system of thought, like how the proposition relates to other things. What kind of conclusions can you draw from it, right? What are the inferences in which you can participate and figure? That's what gives it meaning. And so in this way, like sort of propositional truth is reduced to kind of inferential validity. The inferences are the basic thing. The propositions are secondary, if that. And so you can see how like there are these traditions in the philosophy of logic even, which are kind of biased. From Peirce's perspective, they're biased in favor of certain, categories over others. One of these categories over others, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to get back to how how he arrived at these three categories, firstness, secondness, and thirdness. And you said that in the sort of Kantian spirit, they are implied by his logic, and he thought that monadic, dyadic, and triadic predicates were necessary and sufficient for logic. But I'm one thing that I'm not following entirely is why Tychism arises out of this, why it arises out of firstness. And I wonder if, I mean, this doesn't sound like it plays any role in it at all, but did he not think that physics should be important for whether or not there is genuine chance in the world? He thought that this could be determined from first logical principles.
Yes. I mean, he thought that we arrive at the categories by reflecting on what are the fundamental forms of judgment. And we obtain some sense of what those fundamental forms of judgment are through a kind of a priori investigation into the world. It's a funny thing about Peirce that on the one hand, he is so steeped in science, right? Like he's steeped through and through in science. He really has thought probably more than any other philosopher of his time about the methodology of science. And he elevates it in his own writings as a really important tool. It's some sort of the great tribute of our time that we've attained this kind of the scientific state of rationality. At the same time, in his own philosophy, he's oddly he's rationalistic, he's a prioristic, he's all of these things that we generally don't associate with science, right? But I would say it's a kind of interesting fact, to my mind anyway, that if you think about it, if you think about the history of philosophy, the figures who have been most, the figures who are really, properly speaking, the ones who have made real science, let's say the figures in the history of philosophy who made real contributions to science, almost to a man, they were not empiricists, right? We tend to associate empiricism with science. We think that that's the natural philosophy that allies itself to science. But if you look at the history of philosophy, the picture is very different. The figures who are most closely associated with the philosophy of empiricism, a philosophy of mind, an epistemology that is empiricist in nature, none of them are scientists in their own, none of them have any understanding of the practice of science. We were talking about figures like Hume and Mill, right? And Locke. These are the great empiricists, right? That we think of when we think of, maybe am I missing somebody? Let's go with those three. Okay. We've got Locke, who was a politician, never did any science. Hobbes, who was a classicist and a kind of really bad geometer.
I was thinking
right?
that.
Who thought he'd come up with all these bogus proofs of how to square the circle.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Had no background in science at all. And who also really meant Hume, who was really, properly speaking, a historian. That's what he was famous for. He wrote a history of England. So none of these were scientists in any sense of the term. They were men of letters, really, right? All the advocates, the great proponents of empiricism, were all men of letters. If you look at the men of science who figure in the history of philosophy, they're almost all rationalists who subscribe in one way or another to some a priori conception of knowledge, like Leibniz, Descartes, Peirce, right? They all had extreme rationalistic tendencies. And so it's really interesting, right? It's interesting that rationalism tends to be something, it's a philosophy that often develops from the mind of scientific people when they turn their attention to philosophy, or when they choose to philosophize. Empiricism is kind of it's this, it's the philosophical product of completely unscientific thinkers. That's not to say it's wrong on account of that, but that's just to say it's very detached from the practice of science in that sense. And so I think casually in the mind of like, the way we think about this, we tend to associate empiricism with science. But Peirce obviously saw no conflict between his claims about science and his like rationalistic and a prioristic scruples. He thought they were totally in line with one another. And so, yeah.
Is something you might have left out that could be very important from Peirce's biography was whether or not he was religious in any substantive way?
He was. I mean, I think in a substantive way, he was. So there are different ways of thinking about Peirce's religiosity. He wrote a paper, called A Much Neglected Argument for the Existence of God. And in this paper, he basically, it's meant to present what he takes to be a kind of the sorts of considerations which would incline one towards a belief in God. The paper itself is really strange because he talks a lot about like intellectual play and the play of the mind. And it doesn't feel like it's anything like an argument for the existence of God. But I think if you read more closely, like it's a really interesting and like suggestive document. I think what Peirce thinks ultimately is that the way that, and again, I'm not sure that I agree with him on this score, so I'll just tell you that I'm reporting what I think are Peirce's views and not my own. I think so. What Peirce thinks is that the only philosophically respectable route to a belief in God comes by way of a sort of deep and sustained reflection on the fact that the world has a diversity of categories. There are different ways of describing the world, which make sense as descriptions of the world, and which in their own way present themselves to the mind as complete. So for example, there is a perfectly coherent way of thinking about the world as a big collection of facts, which just stand in certain relations to one another, right? It's like a big book of facts. And maybe you can read this book and you can discern some interesting connections, which will allow you to move around within it in a kind of fluent way. This is kind of like a Humean picture of the world, right? Where it's just a collection of facts. They're just brute facts. And that's what the world is, right? That's one way of conceiving of the world. There's another way of conceiving of the world. So in Peirce's terminology, that's kind of a way of focusing on the kind of secondness of the world. There's another way of thinking about the world as, or of actuality, right? As something which has like come to be. It's like something that is like becoming, right? So amongst a set of possibilities, certain actualities are realized. And the world consists of the continued realization of certain actualities as against other possibilities which are left unactualized, right? It's just, if you want to think of it in like terms of like events, it's happenings or events, right? Also a perfectly coherent way of thinking about the world. So, and let's just also grant that there's a way of thinking about the world as a thing unto itself. This is the kind of the first way of thinking about the world, as like something which is what it is in virtue of nothing else, just kind of something complete in itself, and without any reference to anything outside of it. So there's these different ways of conceptualizing the universe for Peirce. And I think he thinks the only way, so when you see, when the philosopher is confronted by this kind of plurality, there are all these different ways of thinking about the world, and yet somehow they all fit together. They don't fit together by reducing one of those ways to another way. That's important, right? And the philosopher has to come to grips with the fact that there is no such reduction, okay? They're all ways of describing the world. None of them are reducible to the others. And yet, in some sense, there is one cosmos that comprehends all these different ways of thinking about the world. And I think Peirce thinks that line of sustained reflection, like thinking hard about that, is sort of the philosopher's closest approximation to like a religious belief. It's something that feels like a religious belief, but has a certain philosophical credibility to it.
Yeah, it does.
So so for Peirce, the way religion enters into philosophy is through this kind of thought. It's by deep reflection on the diversity of ways that the world is, a kind of understanding, and this is hard earned, an understanding that none of those ways of thinking about the world can be reduced to any of the others. So they're all in their own way, like self-standing and fundamental and kind of irreducible to the others. And then the sense that there must be something that comprehends the whole. That's the religious sentiment in the philosophy. That's the philosopher's route to religion for Peirce, if you will.
Does this at all connect to another of his neologisms, a view that he had called cynicism?
Cynicism.
The reason
I'll
just say the reason that I would have thought that is roughly I take it to be the idea that the universe is a continuum and it can't be sort of blocked off into partitions. And this sort of relates, at least in my head, to this idea that there's this one governing cosmos.
Yeah, no, I mean, Peirce thinks that, so when Peirce calls his philosophy syncretistic, what he means is that it sees continuity as like a really essential notion for philosophers to come to grips with. Like, Peirce really thought that, like, he was familiar with all the kind of mathematical developments in the theory of continuity, right? And he appreciated all of that work, and he thought it was very important.
You're talking about analysis, right?
Yeah, analysis and you know, the work of like Cantor and these. So he was familiar with all of that work, and he believed that continuity was like a really central notion to come to grips with, and that a lot of our philosophical confusions were owing to the fact that we didn't properly incorporate like continuity into our theories, that everything was discrete, everything was discretized, right? And that even our theories of mind needed to accommodate the idea of like continuity, right? That is, reasoning isn't just like you have a thought and then it leads to another thought, which leads to another thought, right? It's a continuous process of development where thoughts, even once they leave consciousness, let's say, are still present in some like lesser way in the mind. They've just sort of dispersed. Peirce even has this view that like the structure of the mind is one in which, like, if you were to describe it, like the content properly described would have to have the structure of like a wave that like sort of disperses outwards. So you have an idea, and the idea is present for a moment, and then it sort of spreads. It spreads itself out. And so like, yeah, continuity was a really important part of Peirce's thought on this point. The point about the religious attitude, and you know, I don't know how closely that fits with, I mean, the continuity is an important part of the story. Also, I think you mentioned earlier what Peirce calls agapism, which is this like idea of evolutionary love. That's his way of, I think that's his way of like introducing this. It's his way of like giving a name to this like religious conclusion of where his metaphysics leads him, right? That ultimately sort of the picture of like how the world evolves, right? Is like, so it's like, how do I put it? You know, the way we should think about the universe in some sense, the way that can, you know, make the most sense of all of these different ways of categorizing and thinking about the entities that exist within it, is to think of it as like something that is the product of it itself. It is growing by itself, right? It doesn't need the help of another person to grow it, but its growth is somehow tended to by sort of, I don't know, some kind of like caring presence in the universe, right? That the growth is directed in the way in which, for instance, we might direct the growth of a plant if we were a gardener, not by growing the plant ourselves, the plant grows on its own, but sort of by clearing out the weeds, by like putting it in an environment where it can properly thrive, right? This is what the gardener contributes to the growth of the plant. And for Peirce, like we sort of have to, he thinks we have to countenance some, gardener style force in the universe, which is essentially doing that, right? Which is growing the universe in that way. And that's ultimately why he calls his philosophy like a philosophy of love, but, or agapism. But, yeah, so anyway, we've gone very deep on Peirce. We've gone very deep into Peirce.
No, no, it's good. I mean, this is exhaustive. The not exhausting, but exhaustive. But the continuity you were describing with regard to cynicism sounded much more conceptual than the idea of physical continuity that I was imagining. Did cynicism extend to time and space? Because I was wondering if it was like useful in the sense that if Peirce adopted cynicism, then he might be able to answer puzzles or preclude solutions to ancient puzzles, like Zeno's paradoxes of motion. So if the universe is fundamentally,
yeah, there is a. I mean, I know of an. If it's not an essay, it's like an excerpt from something where Peirce says this, right? He says more or less that like, the solution to all of these ancient puzzles is just owing to a clarified understanding of continuity. It's kind of surprising. I mean, it's interesting. Like so many people, even today, like still get tripped up by these regress arguments, right? It's such a difficult kind of thing to overcome. We still get tripped up by them. So you still see regress arguments all the time in philosophy, right? Not just in like unrespectable philosophy, but like in academic philosophy, in like real respectable philosophy, you'll see regress arguments that fail to take into account, I think, certain aspects of like what we now know to be the correct theory of continuity, right? Like there's a very tempting thought. It's a kind of fallacy of thought that people have, which is that if every effect has a prior necessitating cause, then there must be some like first cause, right? And that this process has to continue on back to infinity or something. Or else the process continues back in this infinite regress to infinity or something. But I mean, that's just not true. Like there's every number, every real number in the unit interval, there's a number between that and zero, right? Which could have been its precipitating cause. You
don't think that it might be true? I mean, if space and time, for instance, are discrete, then it might be true. And there are physicists who think that it might be. So it's not totally ruled out. It's an empirical question to be settled.
Yeah, I mean, even if space and time are discrete, I don't know how much that affects our thinking about Zeno's paradox. I mean, this gets into other issues, but I'm not sure how much that affects. I think it makes
Zeno's paradox much easier to solve, because then you can just deny that you can continually divide this interval between wherever Zeno is and wherever he's trying to go.
Yeah, but it yeah, I mean, I suppose that is true. Yeah, you could say that that there's like a Planck scale kind of jump that has to happen.
It does make then motion quite difficult. I mean, then you run into like the arrow.
Yeah, exactly. So there's other paradoxes which sort of loom large once you take
the stadium
that,
too, which is quite. Do you know that one?
No. What is the stadium paradox? Which one is
that? Yeah, it's. I think it's called the stadium. It's sort of difficult to explain without visualizing, but if you imagine space and time as being discrete, maybe I'll totally blunder this, but we'll see how it comes out. Space and time being discrete, you have two things right here. So they're at a diagonal to one another, and if they're moving in. So if one's moving, here's one step then it's right above the first thing. Then second step, it's right here. And they've gone past each other. And at one point they were parallel to one another. But if they're both moving and they do this sort of flicker dance from here to here, they like move past one another without ever being next to one another. And that seems to be paradoxical. For our audio listeners, that was totally incomprehensible. Okay. More incomprehensible than my little diagram. But I haven't looked at this paradox for a year or two. So anyway, the point is that there are other puzzles if space and time are discrete.
Are discontinuous, yeah. No, there's all sorts of issues that come up with discontinuity. I don't think Peirce himself actually had that much to offer by way of like, interesting additions to the theory of continuity, at least as it applies to like physical theories of space and time. I just think he thought it was like a really important concept for philosophers to come to grips with. And I generally think I agree with that.
One last note on agapism is that this process of the evolution of the cosmos was agapasm. And I liked that.
Was it really? Is that how he described it?
Yeah.
Agapasm was the process of evolution. Yeah. I mean, Peirce is like a real, he's very artful in his terminology. You can read his semiotics and you just see there's just so many interesting distinctions that are drawn and so many interesting uses of words. Like a lot of it is like wordplay. Yeah. I mean, the distinction that there's a famous, the last manifestation of these categories of first and second and thirdness that's probably worth mentioning are these three varieties of signs that are now famous in Peirce's semiotics. He distinguishes between icons, indices, and symbols. And these are different kinds of, these are different modes of representation, different ways in which signs can refer to the thing signified. So an icon is like something which refers to it by resemblance, let's say. So like think of a portrait, right? If I paint a portrait of you, what makes it a portrait of you, right, is like the properties of it resembling you. So this is like an icon. It manifests firstness. An index is like, if you think about like an exit sign over a door, right? What makes the exit sign a sign for that particular door is its physical location relative to the door. It's like placed above the door, right? It's something like brute and physical about the relationship between the sign and the thing signified. And then a symbol for Peirce is something which relates to the thing signified in a much more arbitrary way. So if you think about like words in language, right? Like, why is it that the word cup, that phoneme, right? Why is it that that signifies this kind of object? It's not because of any kind of like resemblance between the word and the thing, nor is it a product of any kind of like physical relationship that the two stand into one another. Except maybe in the case of like onomatopoeia, there might be a resemblance between the word and the thing signified. But in most cases of words, like there is no such resemblance. Neither is there any kind of like causal story that one can tell. It's just, it's like an arbitrary convention. So the third mediating thing is like the convention of language. That's the thing that's like mediating between the sign and the thing signified. And so symbols are like words in a language. Whereas icons and indices are other ways of like signifying things that correspond to Peirce's categories of first and second. But I think we've belabored the triad to the point of exhaustion now. I don't know. I mean, like Peirce makes heavy use of it, and most of his later writings are preoccupied with it. But anyway, it's the part of his philosophy that people are probably not so familiar with. So it's interesting maybe to give like an introduction to the topic, although it's very it's dense and convoluted and probably can't be adequately conveyed in this kind of forum. What Peirce is more known for is his affiliation with like the American pragmatist movement. And so, I think pragmatism is something that it is like easier for people to wrap their minds around and associate with Peirce than some of this heavier metaphysics. So that's actually, that is one aspect of Peirce's philosophy that I do in one way or another kind of subscribe to. I think if there were a word that really that did capture in some sense my philosophical perspective on things, it would be pragmatism. Although that's a terrible word and it's super like fraught with misunderstanding and confusion.